Plymouth began as a brand in 1928 and was erased from the marketplace after 2001. But in the intervening years, Plymouth churned out a number of beautiful vehicles. Everything from, I would say, the late model Prowler was one of the most interesting ones, and I think it's a great-looking vehicle. And then, of course, you have to say that the halcyon days of Plymouth were really 1957, 58, when that forward look first came out that Virgil Exner and his team devised. Those were some of the hot days for Plymouth and actually significantly increased the sales. Plymouth took over the third-place sales crown in 1957, displacing Buick, who had really owned that space for a number of years. Unfortunately, after 1957, Plymouth really started to lose sales as well as market share. So this wasn't just a fact of the late 50s recession. Plymouth, like I said, not only lost sales in number, but also lost significant share among the low-price three. As an example, in 1957, Plymouth sold 762,000 vehicles and had a 19.3% share of the overall low-price three, Chevrolet, Ford, and Plymouth. Now, by 1961, Plymouth sales had plummeted to just 350,000, less than half what they were in 1957, and the share had gone from 19.3% to 11.6%. So a precipitous decline in overall share across those model years. So what really happened during that 1957 to 61 period? Well, I would contend that the steepest drop that Plymouth saw in its share as well as sales really happened with the introduction of the 1960 and 61 models, although share really had declined pretty significantly by 1959, in large part because those 57 cars, while beautiful, did not have great quality. They rusted very easily. They didn't have full wheel wells, so you'd often see the fender tops rusting out behind the headlamp buckets. They just had general quality issues because, well, they weren't assembled very well, and that reputation caught up with them. But beyond that, the 1960 and 61 Plymouths, I would really say, were the beginning of the end for Plymouth because they never really quite recovered from that 1960 and 61 period to reclaim their halcyon days. And in fact, in 1962, Plymouth certainly didn't do itself any favors by not having a full-size car in that particular model year. That was allegedly because some Chrysler leadership overheard General Motors leadership discussing new models in the early 1960s and talking about how they were going to become significantly smaller. And so Plymouth was left with no full-size car. In fact, Dodge was left with no full-size car in 1962 until they rushed the 880 out. But regardless, well, that was another kind of nail in the Plymouth coffin, if you will. Now, I must admit, Plymouth's sales fortunes were revitalized by the K car as well as the minivan in the 1980s. In fact, 1988 was actually a great year for Plymouth, but it still only sold about 650,000 vehicles versus the 700,000 plus that were sold in 1957. So let's examine a little bit more about the 1960 and 61 Plymouths and why they arguably were kind of the first nail in the coffin for Plymouth. But let's discuss a little bit about the history here of the 1960 and 61 Plymouths by beginning in 1957. And the interesting thing about the 1957 Plymouths was that their ad slogan at the time was "Suddenly It's 1960." And it was really true. Plymouth and Chrysler styling in general had leapfrogged the competition by this point and really set General Motors, the then styling leader, back on its heels. And we've detailed in previous videos a discussion about the so-called Palace coup, where the designers really rose up and came up with alternate proposals to what GM was going to release in 1959 when Harley Earl, the then vice president of GM Styling, was over in Europe. And in fact, the 1959s that came out were rushed to market. There were a lot of shared components. Even the front doors were shared on those because of cost savings, but also just time and tooling and getting the cars ready and rushed into production. So Plymouth had taken that styling crown from General Motors during that time frame. But by 1960, you could almost say the ad slogan should have been for the 1960s, "Suddenly It's 1957." Now, why do I say that? Well, let's remember that the 1960 Plymouths would have been designed in 1957, and so they basically followed a very logical formula. More specifically, the 1960 Plymouths had the same 118-inch overall wheelbase from the 1957s, but they were 5 inches longer, and they clearly had much larger grills and higher tail fins because, well, if the 1957 tail fins were good, why not do something that's even bigger during the time frame as opposed to toning it down, which Plymouth actually would do for the 1961 model year. And there was a profound change for 1960, but that didn't really factor in, I don't believe, to the styling or even the sales, and that was Plymouth's first year for the true unibody chassis. But again, that was not something that most customers arguably perceived. Instead, what was perceived was that the 1960 and 61 Plymouths were starting to look dated in comparison to some of the competition, which did still admittedly have some fins. Chevrolet, of course, for 1960 had horizontal fins like the 59. Ford also had horizontal fins in 1960. But the overall look here, particularly this front end with a very strange, let's say, molding that goes from the grille around the side of the car and then diagonally down the fender where it connects to a rocker molding that goes the entire length of the car rearward. It just looks kind of strange. It doesn't look, well, all that contemporary or all that forward-thinking like the 1957 Plymouths did. And for 1961, the front end got worse. As you can see here, as opposed to going with a more lean and svelte look like Chevrolet had for 1961, the Plymouth has this pudgy and doughy and soft look with this tremendous surface that is almost sitting on top of the fender above that molding, and that comes down and swoops around in the front of the car and bisects the headlamp nacelle. The side surfacing is also very bizarre. Notice how fat that fender is above the molding, and then it gets a little bit leaner underneath it, and as it goes to the doors on the vehicle, and then the rear quarter is also fat again. You can see it again here in almost a near side view, but look at how that front fender above the molding is just kind of fat and poofy, almost like you stuck an air inflator in there and it expanded. And then the underneath section is kind of trimmed to mate up with the door. It just looks bizarre from this angle, from the dead-on front. The bumper is also a very complicated design with those ridges in the middle. Overall, this is a, let's say, complex surfaced car. And it has some interesting features, particularly that scallop out of the rear quarter, that then you have the bullet taillights that come out of it. I actually think that's pretty tasteful. But this front end, I think in particular, just turned people off. They didn't quite know what to do about it. And remember, this was the entry for Plymouth in the low price 3 field. Most people don't want cars that are offensively styled in that particular price class. They just want a car that looks good, that's not necessarily controversial. And I think you could say the 1961 Chevrolet, as an example, would be one case of that. This Plymouth would be something that you'd have to really like to be seen as driving something different, almost the Tesla Cybertruck of the day, let's say. And yes, you are seeing a lot more Tesla Cybertrucks on the road, but there's still probably only about 25,000, maybe 30,000 sold each year. It's a relatively small seller in the context of the overall automotive market. I wouldn't say that the 1960 and 61 Plymouths were bad cars. In fact, they had a number of, let's say, worthwhile attributes associated with them. In 1960, let's talk a little bit about the model lineup. It was pretty similar to 1959, except that the separate and limited production Sport Fury series was dropped, and that meant that there was really an expanded Fury series of models to serve right there at the top of the Plymouth lineup. The Belvidere and Savoy each moved a notch down, and the bottom line Plaza was eliminated. And what a bad name for the worst, let's say, bottom-end car in your lineup, the Plaza. It's, well, whatever. Now, under hood, there were a series of V8s as well as a 6-cylinder engine that was available for 1960. On the V8 side, there was the 318 that came in 230 horsepower form with a 2-barrel carburetor, 260 horsepower form with a 4-barrel, and with the dual exhaust Super Pack. Then there was what Plymouth called the Golden Commando 395, which was a 361 cubic inch V8 with tuned intake manifolds, twin 4-barrel carburetors, and 305 horsepower. And new for 1960 was the first of the famous 383s, and there was a 383 that packed 330 horsepower with long ram tubes and twin four-barrel carburetors, and it was labeled the Sonoramic Commando. Now that sounds, well, kind of interesting, but those Sonoramic Commandos were pretty fast vehicles, going 0 to 60 in under 8 seconds, which for the time, especially a low-price 3 vehicle, was a great feat. Now, on the 6-cylinder side, there was also the slant 6 engine, and there was the aluminum head new slant 6 engine that was designed for the Valiant, but it also came over in the full-size Plymouths. The Valiant had 170 cubic inch slant 6, but in the full-size Plymouths, there was a 225 cubic inch version that was rated at 145 horsepower. So not a lot of, let's say, horsepower here, and probably took about 18 seconds to go 0 to 60 with one of these slant 6s and the big cars, but that was fine. Remember, this was a time before expressways and things like that, and for people that were just putting around town, the slant 6, as anybody knows, was a great engine, although the aluminum head slant 6 did have some challenges associated with it. Now, there also were some interesting options that you could get in your Plymouth. There were the swivel seats that were generally a good idea, except if you had somebody in the back seat and then you swiveled it, well, you're going to injure their knees, so maybe that's why those went away. And you could even get an onboard record player in your Plymouth for $52, plus the cost of the radio. And an interesting one that I was pretty surprised by, but they had what they called the Safety-Matic door lock system that ended up locking all the doors when the engine was started. So as soon as the engine started, your doors were locked. I thought that was pretty interesting. I didn't realize that that had come so early on these vehicles. And if you had a two-door hardtop, you could even get what was labeled the sky-high rear window, which meant the window extended into the roof. It cost about $23, and it was just something that you could have a little bit of glass out back there. Certainly an option that you don't hear of anymore today. At the end of the day, Plymouth didn't have all that great of a year. Remember in 1957, as I said, they were selling over 700,000 cars, and in 1960 they sold 450,000 vehicles and had lost some pretty significant share. They had less than 13% share in 1960 of the low price 3, down from over 19% in 1957. It would get worse for 1961. And again, I think a lot of this can be chalked up to the styling, which Motor Trend said spawned a whole new generation of Japanese sci-fi monsters. That was their interpretation of the styling. Unfortunately for 1961, the styling only got more awkward, and Plymouth did a significant restyle, as you saw, for 1961. But the doors were unchanged as well as the roofline. Perhaps that's the reason why the fenders and the quarters on the 61 are kind of pudgy, but the doors are not, because that was not part of the relatively clean body sides from the 1960. But it just looks awkward that Plymouth stylists tried to, make those work, knowing that they didn't have new doors. It's almost like they wanted new doors, but they didn't get them, and they were pouting with their styling over the fact that they didn't get them. Regardless, that constraint certainly left the 61s looking bizarre, in addition to the strange front end, which they did have money for, and that was what the designer selected, was to go with a very odd front end. Overall, there weren't too many changes aside from the styling to the 1961 Plymouths. You still had the Savoy, then the Belvidere, then the Fury, and various body styles within each of those trims. I did forget to mention for 1960 and 61, of course, you had the wagon, which was labeled the Suburban, and it had different trims. The Deluxe, which was actually not all that deluxe. It was the lowest price point wagon, at about $2,600. There was the Custom that was one up, and then there was the Sport wagon, the most expensive, which stickered for about $3,000 base price. Now let's turn for a second to the interior of these Plymouths. First, the 1960, which is, let's just say, an acquired taste, just like the exterior. You have this Squircle-style steering wheel that I have to imagine the drivers didn't necessarily like that. It's pretty popular today, but when you're turning this wheel quite a few turns back in the day, it's kind of hard to get the right grip on a wheel that's not perfectly circular. Nonetheless, that's what Plymouth did, as well as other divisions of Chrysler at this time, including Imperial. And you have an interesting four-spoke design, very sci-fi-esque. This whole thing looks like it's out of a sci-fi movie, with the push-button torque flight transmission there, the buttons on the left, the rolling drum style speedometer that goes up to 120 miles an hour, and this beautiful, I think, kind of simple and clean dash outside of that, especially that panel that is at the bottom of the dash, the lower dash, I think is quite attractive. For 1961, there were some revisions to the instrument panel. The speedometer area looked a little bit different. The push buttons for the transmission as well as the HVAC setup were a little bit different. There was now a two-spoke steering wheel design that, interestingly, was circular again. I wonder why that happened. And of course, you still had the mirror that was jutting out from the top of the instrument panel. So kind of quirky looking interiors to go with the quirky looking exteriors. And again, my sense is that there was just too much quirk here for the average person, and thus Plymouth just found itself having trouble at the end of 1961 with its sales. And unfortunately, as I said, this was really the beginning of the end for Plymouth, as in 1962, the sales didn't get any better when Plymouth didn't really have a full-size car to offer the public at the time. And it just kind of went downhill from there for a number of years until the K car was introduced and the minivan. That kind of gave Plymouth a brief resurgence before it faded out and into history. So what are some of your favorite Plymouths? We talked about the 60 and 61 being kind of the beginning of the end, but there are plenty of great ones like the 57 that I mentioned. And I have a soft spot in my heart for some of the mid-60s era Plymouths that were done by Elwood Engle, and especially the fuselage era Plymouths like the 1972 Fury with the hidden headlights in particular. But put a comment in the comment section. Let me know what your favorite Plymouth is of all time and what you think of these 60 or 61s. Thanks again for watching.